y'all, Jamie from Country Diggers here. Today we're going to talk about War Plan Red. The United States devised attack plan on Canada in the 1930s. This report was released in the 1970s, but not many people have heard about it. And I'm going to shed some light on it. All right, this is an article from Ranker.com by Stephen Roget. Hope y'all War Plan Red, an inside look at the United States' plan to invade Canada. The invasion of Canada by the United States of America seems like something that belongs in fiction, but it's the exact scenario laid out in War Plan Red, an attack strategy drawn up by the U.S. government during the interwar period between World War I and World War II. If the U.S. carried out War Plan Red, tensions between the two countries would likely be high. The comprehensive strategy, designed as part of an overall war against the United Kingdom, called for an invasion and occupation of Canada to prevent the British from using it as a base of attack. Furthermore, this occupation was intended to be permanent, essentially turning Canada into the 51st state. The U.S. created war plans for potential enemies around the world, including several key allies. The period between World War I and II is mostly known as the time of peace, but the planet's superpowers were still preparing for conflict. The United States of America emerged from World War I as a major victor in terms of combat, economy, and influence, and established its militaristic fortitude. The United States government prepared for combat against any nation as the 1920s turned into the 30s. Towards the end of the 1920s, they began drawing up a series of color-coded war plans for the nations the U.S. might face off against in potential conflicts. The list was broad and included a number of key allies. War Plan Red was the strategy for a war against Britain. The war plan, the United States government and military invested the most interest in the United Kingdom. The British Empire might not have been what it was before World War I, but the Commonwealth still had a global reach that would play a role in any conflict. The UK's might necessitated War Plan Red, which contained several similarly color-coded subplans, including scarlet for Australia, garnet for New Zealand, and crimson for Canada. The plans were created at the highest levels of government. War Plan Red and Crimson and other strategies, including black for Germany, orange for Japan, and green for Mexico, weren't just one-off distant projects. All the color-coded war plans were created by the U.S. Joint Planning Committee, the precursor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they involved input from the Army and Navy at every step of the way. These decisions occurred at the highest levels of government, as the Secretary of War and the Secretary of Navy needed to approve the plans, which they did in May 1930. Canada was the only real target in War Plan Red. The War Plan Crimson was the real meat of War Plan Red. In the event of a conflict with Britain, the United States didn't plan on doing much fighting outside of North America. Instead, the U.S. prioritized an invasion of Canada under the logic that preventing Britain from using their former colony as a base of operations would keep the American homeland safe. Beyond that, many Americans in power believed they could win a war of attrition with the United Kingdom and saw the occupation of Canada as the key to victory. Halifax would bear the brunt of an initial chemical attack, as recommended by Charles Lindbergh. War Plan Crimson identified Madrid potential Madrid temple Madrid potential targets within Canada, but the city of Halifax would get hit particularly hard. As the major Canadian naval base closest to the United Kingdom, Halifax represented an important objective for War Plan Red, so much so that the United States government sent legendary aviator Charles Lindbergh to fly reconnaissance missions over the maritime metropolis as they drafted for the strategy. Lindbergh, a suspected Nazi sympathizer, recommended using chemical weapons against the Canadians. In 1934, the gassing of Halifax was written into the War Plan Red as a vital first step. The next step was an invasion across Niagara Falls. Likely the most complicated part of War Plan Crimson was undoubtedly the invasion of Ontario from Buffalo, a mission that involved crossing the raging Niagara River. Home of Niagara River and Niagara Falls. The United States wanted to win control of the Canadian power plants in that region, gaining the ability to cut off electricity from the majority of the population. Ideally, the mission would make use of the several bridges crossing the Niagara rather than the undertaking of fording the river. The plan also included a land invasion throughout the interior. Several other strategic Canadian targets would be invaded over land as War Plan Crimson progressed. Since the United States hoped to move quickly and gain control of vital assets, troops from the Mideast and Northwest would take major cities like Toronto and Montreal, thus occupying the homes of most Canadian citizens. The U.S. Navy planned to occupy the Great Lakes and several key ports. War Plan Red would have seen the U.S. Navy sailing into the Great Lakes in extreme force. The Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River remain critical waterways in the modern era, but they were even more critical in the 1930s. Controlling them was essential to implementing War Plan Crimson. The United States planned to control the various bridges and access points with Army troops. It would also be up to the Navy to maintain a powerful presence in Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. The last step in War Plan Crimson was surveying the Pacific by capturing Vancouver. As a coastal hub on the Pacific Ocean, Vancouver represented a relatively low priority in War Plan Red, but it was a priority all the same. By occupying Vancouver and neighboring Victoria, the U.S. could effectively cut Canada off from the entire Pacific and eliminate the UK's best base on that side of the continent. The U.S. Navy would play a role in the invasion of British Columbia, but troops would also be sent from Washington State as part of a multi-pronged assault. The plans were incredibly detailed and involved rehearsed war strategies. War Plan Red wasn't just an aimless hypothetical exercise. It was an incredibly comprehensive strategy. The U.S. poured millions of dollars into, including $57 million in 1935 alone, just to update it and construct new airfields. The plan was detailed down to the roads Americans would use as they invaded their northernly neighbors, and it was well rehearsed too. When I first heard of this, I thought it was crazy. And then when I started studying and reading it, and it said this was a plan during the 1930s, and they poured millions of dollars worth in it in 1935 alone. Millions of dollars, over $57 million in 1935 alone. And we were going through a depression from 1929 to 1939, and they were planning this. Our government was planning this, and that's what makes me ill about it. Because, it makes me ill that we were planning to attack Canada too, but it really makes me ill that they spent millions of dollars on this in a depression era, when that money could have been spent on the people instead of war plans, and that has me ill. Okay, enough of the rant. On with the story. As part of the War Plan Red, the U.S. military engaged their largest round of war games yet in 1935, with 36,500 soldiers practicing the tactics they would use to overrun the Great White North. If War Plan Crimson ever needed to be implemented, the Americans were going to be as prepared as possible. The public caught wind of the plans in 1935, but President Roosevelt downplayed them, like government does. The U.S. government almost spoiled the whole operation when they authorized the construction of 3 airfields along the Canadian border as part of their 1935 update of War Plan Red. These airfields were dressed as civilian airports, but the government printing office mistakenly published the secret plans, which led to the New York Times picking up the story. The press spread the story about the U.S. planning to invade Canada in the intimate future, but President Franklin D. Roosevelt was able to mitigate the rumors. The U.S. may not have cared whether Canada would declare neutrality. Canada had gained its autonomy from Britain by the mid-1930s and operated as a mostly independent entity. Still, as history has shown, Canada was in some way or another dragged into all of Britain's military skirmishes during the first half of the 20th century. Therefore, War Plan Crimson ignored the country's practical independence while emphasizing Canada's historical and military ties to the British. It was unlikely that Canada would allow occupation without a fight. So taking War Plan Crimson seriously meant the U.S. government had to be comfortable with attacking a neutral neighbor with a preemptive strike. After War Plan Red was implemented, Canada would be absorbed into the United States. War Plan Red introduced indicated the U.S. believed they could win a war of attrition with the UK so long as they occupied Canada. But that raises the question of what would to Canada, excuse me, I can't even read my own writing. The question is, what would Canada do after the conflict ended? Okay. The U.S. government had no intention of returning their neighbors to independence. War Plan Red specifically noted, blue intentions are to hold in perpetuity all crimson and red territories gained. The policy will be to prepare the provinces and territories of crimson and red to become states and territories of the Blue Union upon the declaration of peace. These strategies were kept secret until the 1970s. The details of War Plan Red were continually updated through the 30s, until World War II forever changed the globe. Though the U.S. stopped working on the plan to invade Canada after 1945, as far as the public is aware, of course, they weren't forthcoming with what they had accomplished up to that point. War Plan Red remained a secret until it was declassified in 1974 and uncovered by a Canadian journalist. But the kicker is, Canada had a plan of attack too. Lieutenant Colonel James Buster Sutherland Brown drafted up Defense Scheme Number 1 after an espionage mission along the border, during which he noted American women were a heavy and not very commonly lot. Okay. Despite its name, Defense Scheme Number 1 was bold and featured quick strikes against American targets perceived as weak, with the overall goal of delaying an American invasion until the British could show up with reinforcements. Brown developed the plan in 1921, 9 years before the U.S. launched War Plan Red. Wow, well, Canada planned to attack us before we could attack them. Well, anyway, hope y'all enjoyed, and see you back soon. Bye.